cafes or our conflict or mediation training. Welcome back. I recognised a few of the names, and I hope this session complements what you've already learned from us. But for those of you who are brand new to MMF, you'll still be able to pick things up as we go along. So what is on our conflict cafe menu today? So I want to focus on some of the myths around mediation, why some people are reluctant to engage with it, building on what I wrote in the MMF blog a couple of months ago. But before I do that, I'll just recap first on what mediation actually is, what its principles are, how we see it being used in the health and social care setting, because I don't want to assume you're all completely au fait with what it is. And indeed, I come across a lot of healthcare professionals who, through no fault of their own, don't fully understand what mediation is, or actually think it's something entirely different from what it is. So what is mediation to begin with? Next slide, Simon. The key thing about mediation is that it allows a conversation between the two or three or however many people it is who are in a disagreement that's broken down or has escalated, if you like, into a conflict. Sometimes to the point where people are unable or unwilling or scared perhaps to be in the same room with each other, even a virtual room, or communicate with each other. And through the mediation process, the people will have no option but to hear each other's thoughts and feelings, but also they know that their own thoughts and feelings will be heard, both by the mediator, but also by the other party. And that gives everyone the opportunity to have a better understanding of where the other people are coming from in a conflict, which of course can then open the door to solutions and compromises and cooperation. And in a mediation, the mediator is merely supporting those people to come to their own decision, their own agreement about how to manage the issues that brought on the conflict in the first place. So the mediator is independent. The mediator will never have met the people before, will have no knowledge of the case or what's behind the conflict. And the mediator won't be judging. The mediator won't be making a decision like an arbitrator might. The decisions, and frankly, whether you want to come to a decision or not, is all in the hands of the people in the conflict, the parties, as we call them. And of course, for some of the work that MMF does, an agreement at the end of a mediation isn't always, sadly, a happy ending. Some of these cases might be about difficult end-of-life decisions or ending a working relationship with somebody, but it's about making the most of those unhappy endings when they're inevitable and making it as good as possible, if you like. So the principles of mediation, next slide, Simon. Mediation is voluntary, although there are some that argue it should actually be compulsory in disputes, but it's voluntary. So that means no one can be forced to come to a mediation. And then even if they do, they're able to leave the process at any point. There's no obligation to see it out. There's no obligation to come to an agreement at the end of the time. It's also confidential. That is, everything that's said in the mediation is confidential, and permission is expressly needed to share anything that was said in the mediation with someone external. Even in the case of a workplace conflict where the employer might be the person who's commissioned the mediation. But certainly in conflicts between healthcare teams and patients and families, it's normally only what's agreed, if anything is agreed, that gets put in the medical notes. And the rest of the discussion, if you like, that's got to that point is sort of wiped clean from the slate. Mediation is also legally privileged, something that the lawyers call without prejudice, which means that it's also legally confidential. And nothing that anybody says in the mediation can be used if a disagreement later goes to court or is already in the hands of lawyers and they carry it on. The only times when confidentiality, sorry, Simon, may not apply is if the mediator believes that there's a significant risk of harm to someone, or if perhaps either side is breaking the law, or if somebody who's been in a mediation is then ordered to disclose some information in the future by a court. And those circumstances are quite rare. Next slide, Simon. So even though I said that mediation is voluntary, this is what the judge, Justice Francis, said in the Charlie Gard case. It is my clear view that mediation should be attempted in all cases such as this one, even if all that it does is achieve a greater understanding by the parties of each other's positions. So it's clear that the consensus out there is that mediation is a positive thing in conflicts between patients and families and healthcare teams. And this point that Justice Francis is making goes back to what I mentioned at the start, that the bare minimum that you'll get out of the mediation is knowledge that the other party has heard your opinion, knows your thoughts and feelings, and know that you've heard theirs. And everyone hopefully has a better understanding of where everything is coming from. And that in itself can only be beneficial if that's all you get out of it. Next slide. And mediation can be used in a variety of settings in the kind of medical, health and social care world that we all operate in. Firstly, like I've said, with disagreements between patients and families and clinical teams or social care teams, disagreements about treatment when a patient might lack capacity, disagreements or communication issues between members of the same team, but equally, disagreement or communication issues between members of different teams who are sort of working together to provide patient care, because we all work in this multidisciplinary framework these days, and our teams never work in silos. We're always interacting with others. And then finally, and what I have a specific interest in, if you like, is the breakdown of relationships between health professionals who are not only providing clinical care, but are also running a business together, and that's GPs. And Medical Mediation Foundation could help with any of those types of conflicts. So on to some myth busting now. So there are some well-rehearsed arguments out there against mediation, barriers, if you like, or I prefer to call them myths, which I'm going to attempt to debunk for you based on my own experience. Of course, I'm a mediator, so I'm slightly biased, but I hope that these mythbusters help to solidify what mediation is and why it's a good thing. So the first one that we come across is about the costs. It costs too much, or it's going to add more money to the already kind of mounting costs that we've got in this dispute. Now, of course, mediation does cost money. It's not free. The parties might be paying it for themselves, or perhaps an organisation is, or an employer is. But the financial costs are relatively low compared to the cost of taking people to court. And they're generally fairly fixed too, as relative to what you get if you're going through a litigation route, where the costs can go on and be a little bit unpredictable. But of course, there are other hidden costs in a conflict as well, not just financial ones. All the time that a conflict is dragging on, there will be stress, uncertainty, strained relationships. Whereas if you have a mediation, you can achieve a resolution to all of your issues much more quickly. Yes, it may take a matter of weeks with lots of meetings, but going to court will take much, much longer than all of that. And just a note about time as a cost. Next slide, Simon. When MMF began working at Evelina back in 2013, one of the first things the team did as part of their pilot project was to ask staff to record conflict episodes for a 3-month period. And those recorded conflicts, which were probably just the tip of the iceberg of all the ones that they were handling with, that were recorded 136 of them. But if you look, you can see just how much time they all took to manage, over 400 hours. So there is a time cost involved here too, and that's time which might have been better spent with the patient, the family, or indeed other patients and family members who need the care and attention of the staff. Incredibly frustrating for people like you and I who didn't go into our professions to not deliver patient-facing care. We don't want to be sort of in the back dealing with conflicts. We want to be there delivering care. So that's incredibly frustrating. Same would be true in a workplace dispute. The people involved, the managers, the other members of the team, everybody gets a bit busy sorting out the conflict or trying to just carry on with it, and becomes less focused on delivering whatever it is that the team is meant to be delivering. So perhaps mediation is a time saver as well, in that it stops all of those hours racking up if you were going through a court process, they would just rack up until the court sorted something out. Next slide, Simon. Of course, not all conflicts end up as public confrontations, but this is one that did. The Alfie Evans case, it catapulted conflict into the public domain in a way that was hugely upsetting for everyone involved, particularly clinical teams. Some members of staff left. For some, it was career changing. And even for people observing, families who were perhaps in a similar situation elsewhere started to question what they were doing as parents and say, you know, am I being less of a parent by not going into this sort of battle with the medical team and going to the media and going to court? And it got capitalized by political groups too. No one comes out of those sorts of conflicts well. So the costs, not just financial, are so wide that any dispute resolution technique that can address things as soon as possible is worth its weight in gold, not just financially. The next myth that I'd like to bust is the one about we have a great case, we don't need to mediate. Some lawyers might over-egg how good your case might be. Some people aren't aware of how good their case might be because they haven't actually asked their legal team. But it's quite rare to have a really watertight legal case that you're almost certain to win. But I would say even if you do, what will it feel like to sort of win once it's all over with? And how much time, money, stress, like I've just talked about, will that win legally going through the courts have cost you? And will the loser, if we're going to use that winning and losing language, actually be able to comply with whatever it is that the court has decided needs to happen? Or is it likely that the winner will have to spend even more time and even more money enforcing their win? Because it's worth remembering that people are much more likely to comply with an agreement that they've come to themselves, such as through mediation, than one that gets handed down by a judge. Sometimes judges hand down decisions that people know the other person isn't really going to be able to do, or perhaps the other person feels they're not willing to give in and do it without even more of a fight. It's far better to get something, even if it's not the absolute best thing that a judge could give you, something that you're in control of deciding, rather than nothing, or rather than a judgment that doesn't go your way, or rather than a judgment that you then have to go back and enforce. The next myth is about splitting things down the middle. Thanks, Simon. And yes, in mediation, there may be some compromise, but it's certainly not as simple as splitting things down the middle. And well, the mediations that Medical Mediation Foundation tends to get involved in, they're about humans, they're about children sometimes, patients, emotions. I would argue that all mediations are about emotions, and those are things that can't be split down the middle. Even the very financial disputes that I might get involved in between GPs who are working together running a business, on the face of it, the conflict might all be about money, perhaps how much their building is worth when they're selling it or retiring from the business. But once you understand the conflict a bit more and explore it, there is always a lot more to it than money. And any agreement that is then come to through mediation will include so many other things other than money or integers that can be nicely split down the middle. And that's because in a mediation, the parties are in control of the outcome. And so their agreements are quite unique and creative and contain all sorts of things that aren't nice integers that can be split down the middle. So it's much more, but nothing like splitting things down the middle. The day in court. So usually what somebody means when they say, I want my day in court, is that they want to say their piece. They want to say how they feel. And they want that to be heard far and wide. But mediation allows people to say their piece anyway, in a safe space that the mediator has created, directly to the other party, looking right in their eyes, probably just at the other side of a table without any distractions, any interruptions, knowing that the other person has no choice but to listen And of course, at other points during a mediation as well, the mediator will be making sure that everybody feels listened to by them too throughout the process. In a court, sometimes you might not have the opportunity to say at all what's important to you. But even if you have the opportunity to speak, it might not be what's important to you that's important to a court, bearing in mind that a court is involved, is interested in legal issues and not so much maybe what's important to you. So you're probably more likely to get what people mean by the day in court actually out of court, somewhere like a mediation. We hear, next myth, we hear people say that willingness to mediate is a sign of weakness, but honestly, I would argue the complete opposite. A person who's prepared to discuss their conflict, maybe even their legal arguments, all in this safe space, is actually showing strength, decisiveness, courage to tackle the dispute head on, here and now, with the actual person they're in dispute with, rather than hiding behind a lawyer or a communications team or something like that, and seeking a resolution rather than waiting for someone else to do it for them. And I actually think that shows an immense amount of bravery. It is to be applauded, if anything. The next myth is about the timing of mediation. It's too early, or it's too late now. But I would say early, very early on in a conflict is an ideal time. Mediation can stop a conflict from escalating, and it will be easier to bring people together as they're simply less entrenched in their positions because they've spent less time in them. For those of you who have been on our courses or even attended the last conflict cafe with Sarah, you'll remember that here at MMF, we use a traffic light warning system for conflict. And when conflicts have escalated all the way into the red zone, it's very adversarial. The patient will be completely lost. Huge amounts of energy will be spent on the conflict. There'll probably be some attacks going on, written attacks, verbal attacks, maybe physical ones. The media might know about it. People will be talking about lawyers and going to court or be going to court already. So, of course, anything to stop a conflict escalating to that sort of level, such as a mediation early on, is worth it. But in cases that have already escalated, mediation can still avoid all of those costs that I've already mentioned. Even if the legal action has begun, mediation can still settle an issue. There's nothing like an 11th hour realization of your legal realities and the court outcomes to get people focused together on a compromise. So our experience from mediation tells us that actually it's never too early and it's never too late to mediate. If you're in a conflict, you can mediate it. The final myth is that the other side, we often hear, the other person is totally unreasonable. There's absolutely no point going to mediation because they're just completely unreasonable. And I would say, well, that's all the more reason to mediate. Things often seem impossible before a mediation in a conflict. And yes, there can be lots of poor behaviors and unreasonableness, but those are a symptom, if you like, or a sign of the fact that there is a conflict rather than necessarily being from the person themselves, if you see what I mean. We know in conflict, because we've all, let's face it, been in a conflict at some point in our lives, that it's tough. It feels horrible. Physically, it feels horrible too. And no one at all, not even Superwoman or Superman, acts well and does a good job of dealing with conversations when we're feeling like that. So I'm not saying excuse the unreasonableness, but we just need to be aware that the unreasonableness is just what you see on the surface. And underneath, there'll be all sorts of emotions, needs, wants, fears, worries that will be driving those behaviors and making people seem unreasonable. And there's also a tendency for humans in conflict to make assumptions, unhelpful assumptions, which can contribute to us being seen as unreasonable or the other person seeming to be unreasonable. For example, we don't know what somebody else's intentions are, but because we're feeling really rubbish in this conflict, we assume that they meant for us to feel as bad as we do. And that's an unhelpful assumption to make. When I'm mediating, I often find that the unreasonable person may also just be so scared or so frightened of how far the conflict has gone, maybe how legal something has become, and how out of control they are, that they appear unreasonable because they sometimes aren't prepared to speak at all. They're almost doing a complete avoidance tactic. And sometimes what people need is the safe space, the legally privileged space of a mediation before they can open up, and the time with the mediator first. And when that is all given to them, well, they do open up, and they're a completely different, often entirely reasonable person. Thanks, Simon. So these were some testimonials that we have of when mediation has, well, gone well for people that we've helped. And I would say that not all of these have been mediations that have ended in an entire agreement to all of the problems. But like Justice Francis said at the beginning, mediation will at least give you something positive to walk away from, a better understanding of where everybody is and where solutions might lie. I'll hand back to you, Simon, shall I?
Yes, thank you very much, Claire. Just going to move into the next screen. Okay. So should you want to get in contact with Claire directly, there's her details there. So claire.sieber@medicalmediation.org.uk. And now we have time for our Q&A. So I can see a few of you are using the chat function to submit questions. Before we do that, I'm just going to stop the recording. Just give me a second.